Hello once again and welcome to week 12 of the Cold War. This is an important milestone this week because in fact we've reached the end of the Cold War course. So this will be the last week of lessons, which obviously we're very happy about. But next year we will have an opportunity to return to the Cold War where we'll be doing some exam practice and getting ready for those exams, but also revising the content that we've covered so far. As always, a great place to start is with the GCSE pod episodes relating to this week. This time there are actually three that we're going to cover. They're all quite brief though. There's one which is about Gorbachev, the final premier of the Soviet Union. There's one about the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and one about the collapse of the USSR itself. That's a good place to start. They're uploaded onto Show My Homework, but of course, as always, you can log into the GCSE pod using your school email address. So this week I'm going to begin by talking you through some of the key themes, and it's all really focused around this man, Mikhail Gorbachev. In 1985, he became the last leader of the Soviet Union. Now, he inherits a country that has all sorts of problems, and I'm going to briefly talk you through 5 of them. Firstly, the Soviet economy is not really working, and it's to do with the way that the economic system works under communism. In communism, the government owned everything. It owned the factories, schools, etc. Now, ordinarily, if you owned a factory in, say, Britain or America and it made bad products, the factory would go out of business because nobody would buy the products. But in communism, the products, it doesn't matter how good or bad they are because the government is still going to pay for the factory. They still own it. And as a result, a lot of the things that are being made in the Soviet Union simply are not very good. The cars they make are substandard. And as a result, really the economy is stagnant. Furthermore, by the mid-1980s, there is the beginning of a technological revolution taking place, primarily in America, and it's to do with computers. But whereas the Americans are developing computers that can transform their businesses, that transforms their ability to go into space and things like that, the Soviet Union are far behind and they don't have this kind of computer technology. Thirdly, the Soviet Union has soldiers stationed all across Europe, as well as, of course, in the Soviet Union, but they're also fighting a very long and a very costly war in Afghanistan. Now, this is enormously expensive, and by 1985, frankly, the Soviet Union, they can't afford it anymore. The arms race with America, their missiles, it's extremely expensive. And again, by 1985, the Soviet Union cannot afford to keep building missiles and spending so much money competing with America on this front. Finally, the Soviet Union faces a problem that is common throughout the communist world at this time, and it's that the people are desperately unhappy. There is, of course, the secret police, there's high levels of censorship, there's a lack of freedom, in addition to all the economic problems we've just discussed, and as a result, the people are itching really for change. Now, Gorbachev notices all these problems and he starts to think about what he can do to solve them. Gorbachev's solution to these problems become known as his New Thinking. He introduces a quite dramatic series of reforms, and his intention is to save communism. He wants to find a way to make communism work and to keep the people happy. What he doesn't intend to do is actually bring about the end of communism, which is what ultimately happens. So he is trying to save it. And really there are 3 major things that he tries to do in the 1980s. The first major reform is called glasnost, and in Russian, in English rather, this means openness. And the first thing that Gorbachev is trying to do is change people's day-to-day interaction with the state. He believes in this idea of openness. He thinks there should be a relaxation of censorship. He thinks that communism shouldn't be the hardline dictatorship that it had been. So he's looking to kind of restore trust, to give people greater freedom, with the hope that that would make them happier. The other strand of his reform is called perestroika, and in English that means restructuring. He understood that the economy was failing very, very badly and really had no chance of catching back up to the USA. As a result, he wanted to introduce some capitalist elements into the economy to try and get it going again. So, for example, he wanted some small businesses, some factories to be privately owned, which would then give people an incentive, a competition to create better goods, to make, more profit, I suppose. Finally, he realizes that if the Soviet Union is going to be saved, he's going to have to do something really quite dramatic with regards to ending the arms race. And as a result, Gorbachev and his counterpart Ronald Reagan sign a number of treaties that not only ban the future creation of weapons, but actually lead to the destruction of many, many, many nuclear weapons. Now, this is not only a significant move towards peace with America, but it saves the Soviet Union an enormous amount of money in the construction and maintenance of those missiles. One of the treaties in particular that is groundbreaking is called the INF Treaty, or the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and that leads to the destruction of all missiles within a range of 500 kilometers to 5,500, which, let's be honest, is most of them. Because Gorbachev's reforms were so radical, because they are moving towards peace, moving towards greater freedom, towards greater capitalism, of course, in Britain and America, their reforms are really congratulated. He also has a strong personal relationship with the American President Ronald Reagan on the left, and also, of course, the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher on the right, and that makes it much easier for them to sign deals. The press in the West, in fact, praised Gorbachev so much that this period of positive feeling about his reforms becomes known as Gorbimania, where there's a real sense that change is taking place across the world. So this is a good time now to pause the video. What I would like you to do is to go on to part A and show my homework. You're going to download the 12A information on Gorbachev. Now that covers in a little bit more detail everything I've just spoken about. And what I'd like you to do is then download the task sheet. It's similar to some of the ones we've done in class before, where there are 3 or 4 different tasks, some simple comprehension questions, some a small table, a spider diagram and so forth. Each task is individually explained and should be relatively straightforward. Once you've completed that, we can then move on to part B. So moving on from Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union, we're going to think about their wider impact on the other communist countries in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, of course, in the past, the Soviet Union had very tightly controlled these countries. As we know, when Hungary and Czechoslovakia had tried to change, the Soviet Union had blocked this. Gorbachev takes a very different stance. He says, just like the Soviet Union, if communism in Europe is going to be saved, then the communist parties in Germany, in Poland, in Czechoslovakia are going to have to change as well. And he acknowledges that for the first time, the Soviet Union will not do anything to stop change in Eastern Europe. If they want to move towards democracy, the Soviet Union will not stop them. If they want to move towards capitalism, the Soviet Union will not stop them. And this becomes known as the Sinatra Doctrine. And the idea behind it, I think it was actually a bit of a joke by one of the Soviet ministers. There's a song, My Way, which I strongly encourage you to listen to, by Frank Sinatra. And essentially what it meant was the countries of Eastern Europe could go their way, in inverted commas, meaning you choose what's best for your country. The Soviet Union is not going to invade, it's not going to interfere. So it marked the end of the Brezhnev doctrine of invasion and a period where the Soviet Union is really taking a step back from Eastern Europe. As Gorbachev had made it clear that the Soviet Union was not going to prevent change in Eastern Europe, this led to rapid change and in fact the collapse of communism in Central and Eastern Europe. The process began in Hungary and quickly it started almost a chain reaction. The Hungarians dismantled the communist system and quickly had democratic elections. This was followed by enormous protests in Poland by a trade union called Solidarity that then went on to win a democratic election in 1989. The rest of Europe really were watching on to see what the Soviet Union would do. Were they going to send in the troops? Were they going to prevent this change to uphold communism? And, well, nothing happened. Gorbachev kept his word. The Soviet Union did not prevent change. The momentum grew, and in Germany, the people began to really strongly protest for change. All throughout the November of 1989, the people of both East and West Berlin were gathered in the streets to call for not only the bringing down of the Berlin Wall, but also the end of communism in East Germany. Towards the end of November, the leader of East Germany begged essentially Gorbachev for help. And Gorbachev refused. He said, I'm not sending in soldiers, I'm not sending in tanks, I'm not going to offer you any other assistance because we can't. We don't have either the will or the money to do it. And this really signalled the end of communism in Germany. And very shortly afterwards, the Berlin Wall, in fact, was opened. As you can see in the image, it was a very dramatic moment, and it's worth looking on YouTube at some videos of it. And it became a huge celebration of freedom and is one of the main symbols of the end of the Cold War. The process of change did not stop there, however. Soon communism collapsed in Czechoslovakia in what was called the Velvet Revolution, and finally also in Romania, where the leader Nicolae Ceausescu was in fact executed on Christmas Day, which is one of the many dates in the Cold War where Christmas Day is relevant. And this process of change in Eastern Europe ultimately had huge ramifications for the USSR itself. As we know, the USSR was not just Russia, but a collection of lots of different Soviet republics. And some of those republics watched the changes in Eastern Europe and believed it was their time to break away from the USSR. And in fact, the Baltic countries of Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia all moved for independence from the Soviet Union. Okay, and this started the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. But it didn't go easily. A group of hardline communists, people against Gorbachev, people that didn't want to see the communist dictatorship collapse, they tried to prevent this change. They became known as the Gang of Eight, and they actually put Mikhail Gorbachev under house arrest whilst he was on holiday in the Crimea. And whilst he's under house arrest, they try to undo his reform, they try to take control of the government in Moscow, but ultimately it's a failure. And it fails because the people refuse to accept it. There are enormous demonstrations on the streets of Moscow, and a man named Boris Yeltsin he emerged as kind of the new leader of Russia, and he emerged as kind of a democratic leader for Russia. He made a famous speech, stood on top of a tank in enormous demonstrations in Moscow, and it really marked the end of the communist dictatorship because the people clearly were no longer going to accept it. Once again, Christmas Day played a relevant role in terms of a date, because it's on Christmas Day 1991 that Mikhail Gorbachev resigned, and officially that marked the end of the Soviet Union, and indeed marked the end of the Cold War. What I'd like you to do now is to move into our Part B task. We're looking at the knock-on effects of Gorbachev's reforms in Eastern Europe and also in the Soviet Union itself. What I'd like you to do is to read the information on the collapse of communism, and it's labelled 12B info, and you're going to use that to complete a PowerPoint on each of those events. Each slide has a focus essentially on a particular country, and it'll have a few prompts on each slide as to questions you should answer. What you'll be looking to do is try and answer those questions and develop it in as much detail as possible. You should also find images to appropriately illustrate each of the sections, and of course delete any instructions where appropriate. Obviously, once again, you've got an enormous amount of freedom here to make the PowerPoint your own, to change the formatting, to add extra detail and so forth. And of course, that'll be rewarded with extra LORIC points. There is also a lot of scope to complete any extra research of your own. I think particularly the collapse of the Berlin Wall is very interesting. And of course, once again, will be awarded with extra LORIC points. All of that can be included in your PowerPoint. Finally, once you have finished and submitted both Part A and Part B, there is a Part C quiz on Show My Homework. Congratulations, once you have completed the quiz, you have officially finished this part of the Cold War course, which I'm terming our pre-learning. And as I say, we will return to it in September, where we will do some of the exam practice and also some of the revision necessary to be ready for the exams. Have a great summer, and thank you very much.